Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going right to your head, literally, as we explore how alcohol affects the brain. Like when you're out with friends, having a good time, maybe that second glass of wine starts sounding like a great idea.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
We've got some fascinating research this week that reveals just how quickly alcohol starts messing with our brains, even before we even get to any of those long-term effects that we hear so much about.
Yeah, and we do often focus on those long-term impacts of, like chronic drinking. But what's really interesting is that alcohol starts impacting the brain from the very first sip, like immediately.
Right, like it's not just a gradual thing over time.
No, it's immediate. And it's also very targeted. I mean, alcohol really hones in on specific areas of the brain.
So it's not just like this general fogginess, it's like pinpoint accuracy to screw up your brain.
Pretty much.
All right, well, let's get into those specifics then. What's one of the first places alcohol goes after?
Well, our sources this week talk a lot about the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And anyone who's had a few drinks knows what we're talking about here. The prefrontal cortex, that's like the decision-making center of your brain.
It's like the adult in the room.
Exactly. And alcohol swoops in and basically tells the adult to take a break.
So that's why we make such questionable choices after a drink or two.
You got it. That second glass of wine suddenly seems like such a brilliant idea, even if you know you'll regret it later. Because that prefrontal cortex, it's struggling to keep things in check.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, but it's not just about decision making, right? I mean, what about the whole like stumbling around, bumping into things? That seems like a pretty immediate effect too.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another target, the cerebellum.
Ah, the cerebellum. Isn't that the part of the brain responsible for things like balance and coordination?
Exactly. So that whole walking into furniture phase after a few drinks, it's not just a funny anecdote. It's alcohol messing with your brain's ability to do even basic movements.
Right. And we kind of laugh it off, but it is interesting to think about how even those, like what we consider the funny effects of alcohol, are really just signs of it affecting our brains.
And the research highlights how alcohol's reach goes even further than those motor skills and decision-making that we're talking about. It impacts memory, vision, mood swings, even our ability to concentrate, like all sorts of stuff.
It's like you said, it's targeted.
It is.
Hmm.
And we might not even consciously register these effects.
Right. Like how many times have you been trying to follow a conversation after a couple of drinks and you're like, wait a minute, what were we talking about? That's happened to me before.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Or
Yeah.
like those sudden mood shifts.
Yeah.
1 minute you're feeling happy and carefree, and the next you're, well, maybe a little more emotional than usual.
Totally. And we just brush it off as, oh, I've had a few drinks, but it's really alcohol playing tricks on our brains.
Exactly. And this is where I think understanding the how and why of these effects becomes crucial.
Right. It's not about judging anyone's choices, but more about being aware of what's actually happening in our brains.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that even small amounts of alcohol can have a real impact on us, even if we don't realize it.
So the short-term effects can be kind of funny, kind of annoying, but what our deep dive really revealed is that long-term chronic drinking, that's where things get serious.
Right, we're talking about actual physical changes to the brain.
Like the saying pickled your brain. I never realized how literal that is.
Well, every time we say that, there's a little bit of truth to it. One of the areas hit hardest by chronic drinking is the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus, if I remember correctly, that's the part of our brain that's super important for learning and memory.
Exactly, which is why all this is so important.
Yeah, like when our source talked about how even moderate drinking over time can lead to the hippocampus shrinking, that really got me.
It's not just waking up after a wild night and forgetting what happened, right?
Right, this is affecting your ability to like function every single day.
Holding on to those memories, those moments that matter. It's kind of scary to think about.
It is, and it's not just the hippocampus. Our brains as a whole, they can actually shrink because of chronic alcohol use, right?
Yeah, and you've probably heard that before. But our sources this week, they actually dove into the research. And it turns out it's not a myth. People who struggle with alcohol dependence, their brains really can be physically smaller, lighter.
Wow, so it's actually losing mass.
It's losing brain cells, it's losing those connections between cells.
And that's got to have some pretty serious consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's also a bit of hope here.
Oh. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all.
Hmm.
Because the brain is amazing, right? It can heal.
So some of that damage, it's reversible.
To a certain extent, yes. When someone stops drinking, the brain can start to repair itself. It can actually regain some of those cognitive functions.
Wow, that's incredible. Our brains are pretty resilient.
They are. But, we also can't forget about the impact of alcohol during pregnancy.
Right, fetal alcohol syndrome or FAS.
And those effects, unfortunately, those are permanent.
Yeah, the research was really clear about that. That's a whole other level of serious.
It really highlights the importance of, just avoiding alcohol entirely during pregnancy.
The amount is safe, right?
The risks are just too high.
Okay, so we've covered the short-term effects, we've covered the long-term effects, but what about the chemistry of it all? Like, what's actually going on inside our brains when we drink? Our source talked about the brain's reward system getting completely hijacked by alcohol. Yeah, it sounds like a party in there, at least at first. But then what happens? What about that whole crash afterward?
Right. Well, eventually the party's over. Those feel-good chemicals, the dopamine, the endorphins, they don't stick around forever.
And that's when the trouble really starts.
Exactly, because that crash, that's what leaves you wanting more, craving that next drink to get back to that good feeling.
Oh, so it's like a setup, right? The brain gets a taste of that artificial happiness, and then suddenly regular life just doesn't seem as appealing.
Exactly. It's harder to find that same level of enjoyment without the alcohol. And that's where the potential for dependence comes in.
Yeah.
And that's also where we see a strong link between alcohol abuse and mental health issues, depression, anxiety, all of that.
It's interesting you bring that up because our source this week pointed out that a huge percentage of people dealing with alcohol or drug abuse are also struggling with some kind of mental health challenge.
Right. It's this whole chicken or the egg thing.
Like, does the drinking cause the depression or does the depression lead to the drinking?
It's tough to say what comes first. Could be either way
Oh.
or both happening at the same time. Someone might start drinking to try to cope with existing anxiety, but then the drinking just ends up making the anxiety worse.
Creating this vicious cycle.
Exactly. And that cycle's hard to break.
Speaking of cycles, I gotta say, learning about those specific disorders linked to alcohol-related memory problems, that was intense. And we've all heard, oh, drinking affects your memory, but our source went way deeper than that.
Oh yeah, we're talking serious long-term damage. Like one that really stood out was widespread brain atrophy.
And that's,
Basically, your brain starts to shrink. I mean, literally.
wait, so it's like our brains are actually shrinking? That sounds terrifying.
It's not great. Brain cells die off, and the overall volume of the brain decreases. And it can cause all sorts of problems.
Like what kind of impact are we talking about?
I mean, it can be pretty wide-ranging. Mood swings, personality changes, confusion, trouble thinking clearly, especially abstract thoughts. It can be really debilitating.
Our poor brains. Okay, so that's brain atrophy. What about Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome? I've heard that one tossed around, but honestly, I don't really know what it is.
So this one's really scary. It actually happens in 2 phases.
2 phases.
Yeah, and it's all connected to a thiamine deficiency. And thiamine, that's a B vitamin, vitamin B1, that's often lacking in people who are heavy drinkers long term.
Okay, so what are these 2 phases?
So the first one, it's called Wernicke encephalopathy. That can cause confusion, loss of muscle coordination, even paralysis of the eye muscles.
So you can't even control your own
It
eyes.
can get pretty bad. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, there's the second phase, Korsakoff syndrome. And that's all about memory.
Memory problems on top of everything else.
And not just your run-of-the-mill forgetfulness. We're talking amnesia, difficulty forming new memories, even confabulation, which is basically your brain trying to fill in memory gaps by making stuff up.
Making stuff up.
Yeah, and you might not even realize you're doing it. It's like your brain's trying to compensate for what it's lost.
So you're basically living with these fabricated memories, not even knowing they're fake. That's heavy.
It is. And it shows just how serious those long-term effects of heavy drinking can be.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap things up for today's deep dive. I always say knowledge is power.
I agree.
It's not about judging anyone's choices, but about arming yourself with the facts so you can make informed decisions about your own life and your own health.
Exactly. And, everyone's relationship with alcohol is different.
And that's okay. But hopefully, listening to this deep dive, you've learned something new, maybe thought about a few things a little differently, because at the end of the day, that's what matters.
Absolutely. Being informed is the first step.
And on that note, a huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the brain on alcohol. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.